As optimism grew in the late 2158 that the United Earth UE would ultimately prevail in the war with the Romulans, Star Empire, the UE Space Probe Agency, USPA, which had become part of the UE Stellar Navy, UESN, in 2151, hoped it could soon resume its scientific exploratory duties, which had been severely curtailed since the start of the war. The only ship in USPA had at its disposal were a few old fusion-powered Republic-class cruisers, which had been obsolete even before the start of the war in 2156. Furthermore, as could be expected during wartime, most operating funds and crew were allocated to the military arm of the UESN. However, even before the war, the USPA felt that it had become no more than an appendage of the largely military UESN. With the coming peace, the USPA held out the hope that it could again become an independent organisation on an equal footing with the UESN. To rebuild itself into a viable exploratory force rather than remaining a poor relation of the military, the USPA needed ships that could undertake long, independent exploratory voyages. Although more advanced than any of the USPA present vessels, UESN's first generation of matter/antimatter ships were unlikely to suit the need of USPA. Most of these warships were immense, with crews of 1,000 or more, and require long hours of maintenance to remain in operation. Furthermore, conversion from warship to explorer would likely be lengthy, expensive, and ultimately unsatisfactory. Rather than a small number of large, expensive ships, which the military favoured, USPA wanted large numbers of smaller ships that were more flexible, less expensive to operate, and capable of long missions of science and exploration. The USPA watched with envy as the UESN began to take delivery of the new Comet-class cruisers in October 2158. Although known as lollipops or dumbbells by some old captains because of their nearly spherical command hulls extended on thin necks, Comets represented a second, much improved generation of matter-antimatter powered ships with a length of 124 meters, which these ships were smaller and much less expensive to build and operate than were first generations of antimatter powered ships. The USPA believed that a demilitarized version of Comet would easily meet its needs. In July 2159, Admiral Lawrence Chong, commander of the USPA, approached Monarch Industries, the prime contractor for Comet, with a proposal. Since the war would soon be over and the number of Comet hulls constructed was likely to be cut from 50 units to 25, Monarch offered to build 25 exploratory vessels of Comet for the USPA. Seeing how the plan would benefit both Monarch Industries and USPA, Monarch agreed as Admiral Chong had predicted. The last 25 of the 50 Comet class's cruisers originally ordered were cancelled in January 2160. However, the Admiral Board also agreed to Admiral Chong's recommendation, and another was placed for a class of 25 exploratory vessels of Comet, which was given the name Daedalus. Transforming the Comet light cruiser into the Daedalus Exploratory cruiser involved many changes to its structure. Equipment and drive systems changes included simplifying the underlying space frame for lower non-military stress levels, reducing offensive and defensive weaponry, moving the shuttlecraft bay to the rear of the engineering hull, installing a higher capacity life support system, adding scientific facilities, enhancing the sensors suit and moving it to the engineering hull, increasing the size of the dilithium fuel tank, reducing the strength of the size of the impulse drive, installing additional antimatter containment bottles, and mounting long duration nacelles. In addition, the bridge was placed for the first time in the its now customary position atop the command hull, although these changes were extensive since USPA and Mocha had started design work on Daedalus 6 months before the official decision to proceed with construction. The first unit was delivered for pre-commissioning trials in a surprisingly rapid 6 months. The lead unit of the new class USE Daedalus joined the USPA in September 2160, just 1 month before the end of the war, because they were lightly armed exploratory cruisers. The first Daedalus cruisers were sent on scientific and survey missions far from the front lines of the war. Their primary areas of operation were many regions within UE space which were poorly known or completely unexplored. On these initial missions, Daedalus cruisers served admirably without major malfunctions or system failures. The USPA had hoped that the success of the new class of ship, along with the new climate of pacifist optimism, brought about by the end of 4.5 years of war, would help secure independence from the UESN. However, these hopes were dashed when delegates at the first Babel conference, which convinced in early 2161 to lay the groundworks for the United Federation of Planets, objected to create a purely military unified fleet. In particular, the Vulcan representatives insisted that the that to reassure the Romulans and other neighbouring non-member nations that the future alliance intentions were peaceful, and UFP fleet must have defences and scientific roles. Therefore, rather than becoming independent, the USPA would form the core of the exploratory arm of what was to become the United Federation of Planets, Starfleet. One consequence of One consequence of exploration intended equality within Starfleet was that the one neglected USPA would receive greatly increased funds. Starfleet was that the once neglected USPA would receive greatly increased funds. The Admiral Board decided to increase the number of Daedalus class ships from 25 to 50. However, these 25 new ships were to carry increased weapons so that they could carry out both exploratory and explore and military missions. Originally, exploratory Daedalus ships were designed Block 1, whereas militarization or mixed use Daedalus ships were designed Block 2. In ceremonies held on October 14th, 2021-61, Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco and above the city in geosynchronous orbit, UES Daedalus was struck from the UESN list and immediately recommissioned as Starfleet's first cruiser, USS Daedalus, NCC 150. It can be said without exaggeration that as a class, Daedalus cruiser were the greatest exploratory ships in the Federation history. Although they were not the fastest, largest or most powerful explorers, they did make first contact with more civilizations and mapped more star systems at a great risk to their crew. We must remember that Daedalus cruisers usually were often sent out alone on missions lasting 6 years or more to distances 100 light years past the furthest Federation outposts. At a time when subspace radio transmitters were not carried, if a ship were damaged or otherwise disabled at that distance, the fastest it might expect to receive help was 4 to 5 years. Assuming that the ship could send an automated warp message torpedo, which was then received by a command base, as happened in several cases, most notably with USS Horizon. Ships were lost 1,000 million kilometers from home, and news of their loss reached Starfleet by old-style radio only after centuries. Two common complaints about the Daedalus class cruiser were that they were too small and that their matter-antimatter reactors were unsafe. The first complaint is undoubtedly true. Daedalus ships were extremely small. They were barely 100 meters long and displaced only 25,000 to 30,000 tons. They had been based on Comet-class light cruisers, which had been designed for military scouting duties. As a result, crew facilities were spartan and not designed for 6-year-long voyages without resupply. All foodstuffs and life support stores for the mission had to be carried on board. The addition of scientific equipment, sensors, scanners, laboratories, computers and probes decreased space even more. In addition, matter-antimatter reactors systems took up a significant large percentage of total hull space in Daedalus's than they do on modern ships. When the more extensive weaponry mounted on Block 2 ships is considered, the space storage becomes even more acute. Daedalus class ships had a standard crew complement of 101, of which 76 were required for general ship operations and maintenance. As a result, the few scientific specialists who could be carried on exploratory missions were generally limited to stellar cartography, astrophysics, exobiology, linguistics, geochemistry, and medical staff. Historians and specialized natural scientists were usually not present on long-term exploratory missions. However, cargo holds of Daedalus-class ships could be modified to provide additional crew quarters and laboratories for short-duration scientific or diplomatic missions, such as, for example, stellar phenomena or establishing first contact with alien civilizations. In the 2160s, some ships carried crew as large as 200, although later cruisers' designs were considerably larger. The distinction between exploration and specific scientific missions was maintained mainly for economic reasons. It was not until 2206, when the Horizon class Explorer launched, that Starfleet had a completely self-sufficient science ship capable of independent long-range missions. Whether the second complaint of unsafe matter-antimatter reactors is true remains controversial. While many early Daedalus ships were lost or presumed lost, the fault may not lie entirely with their reactor. Ships may have been destroyed through hostile actions, celestial phenomena, poor judgment, human error, or simply bad luck. In most cases of ship losses, the cause could not be determined because no messages were received by radio or torpedo, and no physical evidence was received at the accident scene. On the other hand, the possibility of a catastrophic reactor failure could not be ruled out. Reactor problems may have arisen because military cruisers of Earth Romulan War era had not been intended to actually cruise for long durations. During the war, individual ships rarely travelled for more than 4 or 5 light years at a time, at least in the later years of the war. Most ships travelled in squadrons or task forces, accompanied by deuterium tankers, tenders and other support ships. More important than long-range cruisers was the ability to reach maximum speed on demand for ship-to-ship combat or attack runs. Frontline ships were dry docked every 18 months for several weeks for thorough examination and maintenance of all systems, including the drive system. In contrast, exploratory cruisers were expected to perform flawlessly at 75% of peak reactor output levels for months at a time, with no routine maintenance performed by the onboard engineering staff. Never before had these sorts of demands been placed on reactors. After 6 or 7 light years of operating under such conditions, some reactors likely degraded, suggesting their reactor failed catastrophically. Several prominent Starfleet engineers changed the Daedalus ships were being pushed dangerously past their limits inherent in their light cruiser origins, and that safety was being seriously compromised, particularly in Block 2 ships. In June 2168, all Daedalus class ships were ordered to return immediately to the nearest starbase for emergency inspection. Some ships' reactors were found to be dangerously degraded and were immediately replaced. Other ships were ordered to undergo extensive preventative maintenance, then scheduled for reactor replacement within 3 years. These factors seem to have been effective, as no further Daedalus losses could be definitively attributed to reactor failure. However, concerns about reactor reliability were great enough that Starfleet's next major exploratory cruiser, the Wasp class, introduced several safety features, including an easily separatable command hull that would increase the chance for the crew survival should a catastrophic reactor failure occur. USS Coraline, a Block 1 Daedalus class ship that had been welded to an asteroid in the X system and used as a habitat module for colonists, has been returned to its original configuration and is on display in the Starfleet Museum.